Well, thanks again for coming to fill the seats on this beautiful Sunday morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Julie Ann Grimm. I've been a member of United for, I think it's safe to say, a long time, since the early 2000s. I've served as the chair of the Adult Education Committee, so thank you to those of you who are on the committee and might be listening later to make sure that I did a good job. I've done that, so I appreciate the challenge and opportunity of putting together speaking sessions that are helpful for our growth as a community, and I'm glad to be invited to do this, even if, I'm a little bit nervous. I'm just going to try to think about it being just us. That's what it is. Right, that's right. When Talitha sent me an email asking if I would be part of the speaker series, she said that she really wanted to focus on the changes and challenges of Santa Fe, particularly over the last 4 years. And I felt like that was a really good topic for me because my life has experienced quite a number of changes and challenges recently. So as to not, bury the lead there, I just finished running the Santa Fe Reporter for 11 years. I was the editor and publisher. Before that, for 10 years, I was the local government reporter at the Santa Fe New Mexican. And before that, for 3 years, I worked at the Associated Press Albuquerque Bureau. And so in case you haven't done all that math in your head very quickly, that means I started working at the Associated Press in Albuquerque in August of 2001. And in September of 2001, September 11th, there was a major news event in our nation, in the world, and I was working at the AP, and my assigned starting time was about 9, 10 o'clock, something like that. So you might also remember that the planes crashed around 8 o'clock our time. And I heard it on the radio, and I was getting ready for work, and I rushed to the office, and I burst through the doors, and my coworker was like, "What are you doing here? Why are you so early?" And I gestured to the televisions, and because back then you had 4 televisions playing in the newsroom because that was how you made sure you could see what was on every network. And of course, that was on every network, but my supervisor says to me, "That's in New York. Why are you here?" And then the phone rang, and it was the bureau chief, and she was like, "Oh my goodness, go to the airport right now. I'm so glad you're there." So I covered 9/11 from the airport in Albuquerque. That was one of my very first assignments in New Mexico, and I had an opportunity then to go and do a lot of things like community vigils in the civic plaza. Hundreds of people standing quietly. I went to church services, and I went to synagogues, and I did all kinds of, coverage that was really around our grief as a nation. I remember being at the airport, and people were coming off airplanes, and I don't know if any of you were flying that day, but people who were on airplanes were the last to know what was going on. They were told, like, we're landing where are we? We're in Albuquerque, is that in the United States? They got off the planes and they didn't know what was going on, and then there was like this kid saying, "This kind of sounds like, it's kind of like Pearl Harbor today, how do you feel?" So a lot of times my job has been to witness grief and ask people what it feels like to them, and your house is just burned down, what are you going to do next? That's kind of a part and parcel of what you do as a journalist. And so it's a very challenging profession. I'm super proud of the work that I did for 24 years as a local journalist. But this spring, I had an opportunity to do something different, and I took it. And so I now work at a local law firm. I am helping use my research and communication skills to work on land use and water policy and advocacy, to help make sure that the laws of water in New Mexico and in our community, which I'm going to talk about a little more because I know everyone's interested in that, to make sure that they're fair and that they are applied to everybody in the ways that they were intended. The law firm that I work for also provides staff guidance to government organizations. One of the things we do is the Buckman Direct Diversion Project, which pulls drinking water off the Rio Grande. We provide the legal counsel to that project. It's kind of an interesting circle for me because when they started building that project, I was writing about it. How are they going to pay for it, and where are they going to put it, and how are they going to run it, and who's going to share it, and all that. So there's a number of topics like that I've sort of learned a little bit about as a journalist that now I'm learning about and doing further research about from a different lens. So for those of you who have been wondering what happened and what I'm up to, that's that. So I feel like change and challenge is a really good theme. I'm not checking my Facebook. I just have some notes about the lecture here so that I don't. So Talitha, could you please remind me what time you want me to be quiet?
You go till 12:15.
Okay.
So leave the last 15, 20 minutes for Q&A.
Okay. All right.
Or you can leave for Q&A earlier.
Okay.
I think people are more entranced with you than they are in the future. So
Well, I'll do my best. You can imagine in 20 plus years of being a journalist, there's a lot of things I want to share with you, and there's things that I think you'll be amused by, and things that I hope will stick with you and that will make you think differently or think more about the community that we live in. So I think when you look at what's happened in the last 4 years, like looking at any other point in time, particularly in our city, you have to look at the longer trajectory. And so I want to talk about an experience I had as a young reporter when Bill Richardson decided to build the Rail Runner train, between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. I was really interested in the idea that there was this little rundown train station. How many of you have ridden the train between Santa Fe and Albuquerque? Okay, so when you go through the Kiowa station, which is on Santo Domingo Pueblo, there is now this thing that has been freshly painted that has like a mural with a Native American, sort of depiction kind of thing happening on it. When they first decided to build the train, to start the Rail Runner, that thing had no roof and no windows, and it was really sort of looked like this forgotten, relic of a time gone by. And I thought it was terribly interesting that the state was going to kind of give new life to this building, that there was going to be this train station. I still think it's great that there are stops at the pueblos that the train passes through, so that those even very small communities can have equal access to the train. I think that's one of the really wonderful things, one of the decisions that was made that was the right decision. But as they're trying to decide, I got really interested in that building, and I called up the governor of Santo Domingo Pueblo. And as a journalist and as a white journalist, you have to be very careful about when and how and who you ask questions related to the Native American communities, and particularly the governance. The governance structure of the Pueblos is not like our governance structure. And people don't feel necessarily comfortable or authorized with saying, I'm on the Pueblo Council, I'm the governor, I speak for everyone. That concept is something that is kind of common in the governance of our city and our state and our nation. But the Pueblo governance structures really aren't like that. So when you're 22 and you call up the governor of the Pueblo of Santo Domingo and you say, who owns that building? It's really neat. Who owns it? And there was a long silence. And he said, well, let me ask you something. Who was here first? And I don't remember what I said, but I remember how I felt. And I hope you can get some sense of how I felt. And I just want to tell you that story to help you remember that every question that each of us asks of people who have been here longer than we have comes with a baggage that you probably don't intend to bring to it when you ask a question, but it's there, and it needs to be acknowledged. And so that's one of the challenges of the industry that I chose, and moving to a place where my people did not have a history. I also think that it's really important to acknowledge, all of the history in our area. And when people often ask you, I'm sure many of you who have moved here have been asked, well, how long have you been here? Where did you come from? And you always hit that point where you're like, I'm here. I'm a local now. Boy, I am. But even if you've been here 40 years or 20 years, you're never going to catch up to the 15 generations before you. And so it's really good, I think, just to keep that, to remember that and come with a spirit of humility. People who were born and raised here or born here all their lives, as you hear them say, they have witnessed an incredible amount of change. And they are trying to absorb that change, and they are trying to roll with it. And it's a common refrain, how much Santa Fe has changed. And some of that change is indisputably progress. But some of that change is also indisputably pain. And I think it's good to try to keep that in mind as well. Even so, as an agent of change and a new arrival, you can fiercely love your home. And I fiercely love mine. And I will often say I'm not leaving until they kick me out. You can work hard to understand your community, and you can endeavor to be an active part of it. I think often too we hear the phrase like, you can try to make your world better. And I think that while most of the time we mean that from the best spirit, when you're saying that to someone who's been here for 15 generations or even longer than that, and you try to talk about how much better your idea is, that also has a lot of baggage and pain that maybe you don't intend. So I want to talk about how you can use the same methods that journalists use to learn and engage in your community and to call for the engagement of others if that's what you feel it's time to do. I've been recently trying to get through this book called Crossings by Ben Goldfarb. Has anybody heard about this book? Larry, you haven't heard about this book? This is a great book. Not to put you on the spot, but this is a book that was published last year, and it's all about how roads have affected the environment, the ecology of the world. It talks about plants and animals. There's a chapter about sound. There's a lot about roadkill. It's fascinating. But one of the things that, and this guy's a journalist, and I love to read, books that have been written by people who've spent their, years and years and hours they're not going to get back researching things and going places. So it's interesting, and I recommend it. But the thing that stuck with me that I wanted to tell all of you about today is that Ben talks about how change doesn't really start to happen. Change doesn't really start to get traction in communities until neighbors and friends and just like people at line in the grocery store are talking about it to each other, with each other. That there can be all the journalism in the world and the politicians can be talking about it and it can be on social media, but unless there are like real human beings having real conversations with each other in real moments, change doesn't happen. And I don't know how, you make that permanent, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but I do think it's a really a poignant idea for our church community as well. That the magic happens when you talk to each other and when you listen to other people, and when you kind of overcome your whatever kind of hang-ups you might have about doing that. And I certainly have some of them, So let's talk about the last 4 years. That was kind of a long setup, but I think that the COVID pandemic brought questions that we will wrestle with, as human beings, certainly for the rest of our lives, but probably for the rest of human history. I think there are more questions than answers, and perhaps it's always that way in every time, and we feel like in our own time, it's the most present for us. But I think, one of the questions I have is it really more crowded now in Santa Fe? Or are we just comparing this to the experience of lockdown and isolation and fear that we all went through? So when you go to La Chosa on Friday night and you can't get in, was it always that way? Is it just because you didn't get to go out to eat every Friday night? I'm not sure I have the right answer. I think there's several. But I think those kind of questions are being asked about a lot of topics, all through our community. And one of the significant and lasting ways in which, I see things having changed has to do with the coalescing of technology and the absolute need for separation that we went through because of the pandemic. So Talitha talked about it this morning. I told everybody that I was a little nervous about this being taped because it's like out there for people to review, and it's not just us here in our community room. But this idea that like everything that happens is now recorded and broadcast on the internet, it's like a scary thing, but it's also really powerful. And it really cuts across these dividing lines that particularly when it comes to like public participation in the government, it erases that. You might not feel comfortable or like you have time. You might not actually have time to go to City Hall for 6 or 8 hours on a Wednesday night and talk about, the water conservation plan that's going to be talked about. But now you can sort of keep it on while you're making dinner. You can listen to it in your headphone while you take a walk. When it's time for public comment, you can like push a button to digitally raise your hand and they call on you. It's amazing. If you want to hear about all of the discussions that happen at the legislature, for example, about this super painful failure of the Family Leave Act in the last legislative session, you can watch 20 or 40 hours of legislative proceedings if you want to. You can really learn about it the same way that journalists learn about it. And you don't have to rely on someone else's interpretation. And this is a new and powerful thing in democracy, and I don't think this should be taken for granted. And we were all a little worried that maybe when we were allowed to be together, when people were allowed to go to the legislative hearings, if the legislature would say, we don't really need the internet anymore. If United Church had said, okay, we're back together, like we're going to shut off our webcast church, we didn't know for a little while if that's what was going to happen. But I do think that the sticking power of that technological change is one of the good things, to come out of the pandemic. And I think that I can't encourage you enough to use that power. Has anybody in the room been to Hamilton, or have you heard it, the musical Hamilton? There is the Aaron Burr song that he wants to be in the room where it happens. And he's been excluded, and this is the great travesty of his life. This new thing with the internet connecting you to the government means that you get to be in the room where it happens. Even if you missed it, you can usually go back to the room and time travel to the room where it happened. And while you might not have a say, and I get that it's not a perfect parallel, I just think that's important and interesting. So I thought I would throw that out there. Okay, so how has Santa Fe changed in 4 years, and who are we? I want to say that we have really wonderful, beautiful things that make our community what it is. It's why many of us chose to come here, chose to stay here. We have public spaces, both indoor and outdoor. We have this community convention center that was built on the site of a former high school that is filled with public art, most of it from local artists. We have parks, we have trails, we have a paved network where you can ride your bike and walk. We have cultural institutions that are both public and privately owned, that are celebrating arts and music and theater. We have so many neat things. We have local restaurants, like we talked about La Chose. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. And we have local media. I just want to put in this one. The Santa Fe New Mexican is a family-owned newspaper. It is the oldest newspaper west of the Mississippi River. There are local people of all ages who are giving their heart and soul every day to make sure that the Santa Fe New Mexican continues to exist in our community. It's very important. And I think that the more connectivity we have and the more the technology makes you able to access information in all of these free ways, it's also important to remember that all those young and old people that work at the newspaper have to pay the power bill. They have to rent or buy in this incredibly expensive housing market, and that every time you spend 15 minutes figuring out a way to read a story for free, you could also just go ahead and subscribe digitally and support the local media. So now that I don't work there anymore, I can really drive that point home for you. The Santa Fe Reporter is owned by business partners who live in Portland, Oregon. It's also been here since 1974, so it is celebrating a big birthday this summer. It is important that there are two competing newspapers with local staff in our community. And does anybody who's moved here from somewhere else, did you come here from a place that didn't have a local newspaper? Did you come from a place that had two local newspapers? So that, that is also, I think, an amenity in our city that maybe sometimes people don't think about very often. But both of those local media organizations depend on local businesses that advertise, that you spend your local dollars at, and they certainly depend on local readers who understand that news isn't free, even though it's all about freedom, right? So that's my little plug for local media. But I think that when you look at what Santa Fe has that's great, that's gotten better in the last 4 years, I think it's important to think about what you value. What do we value? And how do you show that you value that? If you value that we have a transit system, if you value that we have these paved trails, if you value that we have public spaces, how do you show that you value them? How could you broadcast that more loudly? How could you advocate for those things that you love? A less fuzzy, happy, warm thought is that the Santa Fe that we are today is polarized. There are divisions that are real. There are some that are perceived, but they are a part of our daily life. The conflict that happens here is partly present because of the deep history and because of the long change that I talked about a little bit earlier. I think that in the last 4 years, we have been affected by, of course, the national landscape. Much more so in the last couple of years by the international landscape. The way people in our community feel about what's happening in the world and in the nation. Santa Fe has been spared in some ways. We've been spared some of the violence that's happened in other places in our country, but we have not been spared the divisiveness and the polarization. And a couple of examples of that I think might be familiar to you. One of them has to do with the plaza, the box, right? The obelisk, the soldiers' monument, this item, this decoration, this piece of history, however you might want to describe it, has caused it. It's been sort of a focal point for the polarization in our community. So in October of 2020, and I wrote 2024 in my notes, which is actually not right. When the obelisk came down just about 4 years ago, but really in October, that's what I was going to say, about 4 years ago in October. But really the things started to crumble 4 years ago this month, in the month of June, when there were protests all over the country about police treating people, particularly people with brown skin, in unimaginably violent ways that really became a focal point for a protest in our community. There became a large national movement around why do we have monuments to cultural violence? Why are we making heroes out of people who behaved in ways that we're not proud of today? And so in Santa Fe, we have the Soldiers Monument that in the 1970s, there was an individual in town who chiseled the word savages off of the monument. Because until the 1970s, the word savages appeared on that public monument to describe our Native American community members who were the victims of a war as the white oozed across the country. It was also a monument to soldiers who fought in the Civil War on both sides. on the side that we think of as the good side now, right? It wasn't all a monument to badness and savagery. But in June of 2020, the mayor of Santa Fe was facing a lot of pressure. And he said in public, this monument doesn't represent who Santa Fe is today. It does have a history of pain. It shouldn't be in our plaza. And then he didn't act on that statement. And so several months later, in October, on Indigenous Peoples Day, the monument came down. And we had I was at the Santa Fe Reporter then as the editor. We were there, we made a video. The guy who was making the video described the way the ground felt when the obelisk fell. It was a loud sound. There was a puff of, pulverized dust, and you could feel it. And everybody who was on the plaza that day could feel it. And I would say that you can still feel it falling today, because now there's just there's a plywood box there. There is a lawsuit pending in district court. The city spent $300,000 of your tax money and mine on a process that was supposed to bring us cultural reconciliation that resulted in a 250-page report with recommendations that got put on a shelf. There's a lot to say about that topic, but I think it's just a good illustration of sort of the divisions that, continue in our community today. And if you weren't aware that people are still fighting about the obelisk, boy howdy are they. And this wasn't like a new fight. I talked a little bit about the 1970s and the chiseling, but even the previous mayor, rest in power, Javier Gonzalez, who came to United and to a packed crowd, talked about his vision for the future of Santa Fe. He talked about how cool it would be to plant corn where the obelisk is, because before the obelisk there were crops on the plaza. And I'm like kind of a hippie garden type, and I thought that was the best idea, and I kind of still do. Although there's a lot of, there's many more layers. If you didn't think it was possible for there to be more layers, there are now. In the same vein, I think it's important to talk about our public schools and the inequality that exists in our public schools and the polarization and how that affects kids in our community. Just as recently as last summer, there was a huge, ugly debate again at the Santa Fe Public School Board about whether it was okay for the Fiesta Council to come to the school and talk about the traditional replay of the bloodless reconquest of Santa Fe, and how for many people this is a part of their culture and heritage, and they have fond memories of their families and this celebration of Don Diego de Vargas. For many other students, there is a whole another layer of pain that has to do with their family being obliterated by de Vargas and the other families. And then there are people who come from outside Santa Fe and wonder, what in the world what is this? And there's a school board member who is a Native American woman who had the courage to say, what is this? Like, can we work on this a little bit? But I think that what happened was the timing was terrible. They decided to have this discussion about a month before Fiestas. The school board meetings were so contentious. They were 4 and 5 hours long. There were people screaming, and there were people crying, and there was pounding on podiums, and people were talking about swords and blood, and you had to really remember that this was the school board meeting. Right? And our kids have the lowest reading and math scores in the nation. This is what we have to spend 12 hours arguing about. And I don't mean to, make you giggle with that. It's all of those things have their own importance. But I want you to be aware that the journalists and the people who sat on the school board and the people who went and tried to talk about how important this decision was to them, those were painful moments in our community. And they weren't ancient history, they were just last year. And Fiestas is coming again, and it comes every year. And it comes with a lot of joy and celebration and a lot of pain and heartache. And I don't have a great answer. That's going to be my theme of my talk, is I don't have a great answer, but it's what's going on. I think that's a good kind of segue into the economic division that I'm sure you're all aware of, that is part of our community. There is a divide between the wealthy and the not wealthy here that is palpable. And it as you drive across the city, as you think about what happens on the north side when there's a traffic accident or there's a violent crime versus what happens on the south side when the government sells open space that they said they were going to keep in perpetuity or something, like that. When there's a crime, when there's a broken promise, when there's a social contract that's not being upheld, it's treated differently depending on where you are in our city. And that's a real thing that's still happening. That's not ancient history either. The last thing I want to talk about in that vein has to do with the local versus tourist polarization that happens here. Did anybody first come to Santa Fe as a tourist? Right? We have this sort of tension, right, in our community. We have the tourism is important for our economy. It is what is responsible for a lot of our jobs, a lot of the things that we have, the amenities that I kicked it off with saying how great they are. We have them because of tourism. But there are also a lot of things that happen to sort of cater to the tourists and the visitors that make the people who live here, especially the people who were born here all their lives, especially the people who work in the industries that cater to the tourists, it makes those people feel less than. And I think that's another one of the big questions in our community is how do we honor and welcome visitors, and how do we, reap all the benefits that the tourism economy brings to us at the same time that we honor the people who live here, and we make sure that the workers have a quality of life that matches, in some way the quality of life of the people who came here on vacation, for the weekend. So that's another big kind of division that hasn't changed in 4 years. So I thought too that you might want to talk a little bit about housing, since I mentioned that, in the newspaper, covering development and covering, what's been called the housing crisis, which I think is a great label for it here. It's a big part of what our local journalists are called to do. And I think this is a good illustration of kind of where we are with that. Santa Fe was one of the first cities to adopt what's called inclusionary zoning in the late 1990s. And there's other places that have like a similar situation that we do, Aspen, Colorado, Maui, Hawaii. They've tried to do this inclusionary zoning, which means if you're gonna build a bunch of rich, fancy stuff, you also have to build like a little bit of affordable, normal stuff. And that worked to slow the division. It worked to make sure that there weren't only big fancy houses built, but it did not solve the problem in Santa Fe. There are a lot of people who now look at, kind of what our government did with inclusionary zoning, and they have, criticisms of it that I think are pretty valid, and like how it didn't really work out the way that people thought it would. But today, we haven't really landed on an alternative idea that's different from inclusionary zoning, that really allows the economic advantage of having housing, the basic right of having housing, to really be applied to everyone. And so you all probably voted in the election in which 73% of the city's registered voters said, we want to tax certain housing transactions in order to raise money for affordable housing. The media called that tax the mansion tax. One of the big ways Santa Fe has changed is that in 2009, the government essentially did the same thing. They made a similar proposal. It was only going to affect high-end housing purchases. And in 2009, voters rejected that idea. So here we are, 2023, voters approved the idea, and then guess what? The court said It's not legal the way they constructed it. The real estate group, of which there are members of our congregation who are not in the room right now that I know of, that are part of the Realtors Association. And of course, housing and this buying and selling of housing is not inherently like an evil thing. But I think that there again, when you look at it through that polarization lens, there is a big fight still happening in our community about how do we raise money for affordable housing? Who should bear the burden of it? Like, whose responsibility is it? I think we all agree that people having housing is an important concept, but we really haven't gotten there in figuring out, what to do about it. And so in 2021, I had a young reporter who, not all the reporters I had an opportunity to hire were from Santa Fe, but this reporter is from Santa Fe. Her mom and dad still live here. She went to the Waldorf High School, and she came back here to work, and she did an internship, and I hired her as a reporter, and it was my absolute pleasure to have her in my newsroom. And we applied for a grant, and we were very excited. We got a couple of $1,000s for this reporting grant, which allowed this reporter to do some extra training, allowed us to hire someone to take on her kind of everyday work so that she could focus on writing about affordable housing for like 4 months. And she did a 3-part cover series about affordable housing, and she told the readers some of the things I've just told you about kind of the trajectory of how we got here and what we've tried to do as a community. And then her landlord sold her house to a short-term rental company, and she lost her housing and she quit her job at the newspaper. And I think that, her story is emblematic of a lot of, stories that you hear. It's very hard for local businesses to hire and retain young workers because of the cost of housing. It's happening in every single industry. So, in some ways, the last 4 years, I think, have really exacerbated that. When you have the kind of the economic slip and rebuilding, there are some people who have to fight a lot harder to rebuild than others, and it in many ways hits those young people, who we need to become the newspaper editors and the education administrators and the hospital thought leaders of our community. And if we can't get them to come here and learn and care and work, I think that's going to be a problem. I think it's cool though. The cities, the voters showed a willingness to be creative and a willingness to find a way to level the playing field when it comes to housing. And even if that effort, ultimately, if the Supreme Court of the state or wherever it goes and next, if it fails, I think it's still an important moment in time for our community when people said, we have to do something. We're willing. There were a lot of people whose houses would have been taxed who voted in favor of the tax. It wasn't like 73% of the voters are people who don't have houses, And so I think that is something that you can kind of take away of like, how has our community changed and how could that give you a little hope for the future? But that's one way. I want to talk a little bit about who we make the villain in our community. When I first became a reporter and I had to cover housing developments, I heard this over and over again about the evil developers and the evil real estate agents. They're dirt pimps and they're changing our community. And it was really common to put the black hat on the developers to villainize them. And even when Commissioner Hank Hughes, a county commissioner and former member of our congregation, was here speaking last week, there were a couple people who asked questions like, and the way that we say the word developer, sometimes it comes out, it's like a developer, it's like a bad word. But if we want to have houses, if we want to have churches, if we want to have community centers, and we want to have doctor's offices, like we need those people. We need to make sure that our rules for development in our community make sense. We need to make sure that we're not allowed to build neighborhoods that don't have sidewalks. We need to make sure that there's connectivity for transit. Instead of fighting every development just because it's the evil D word, I think we're giving up our power. If you try to work with what's happening and you make sure that your values are reflected, how much is it going to cost? Why does it cost that much? Can you build a bigger park? Versus, we don't want anything because whatever you build is going to be between me and my view of the mountain. And those apartments are going to interfere with like the way the moon shines in my bedroom window. People really say this stuff at community meetings. And so I just think it's another way that we can look at our community. How can we be compassionate troubleshooters? Instead of fighting with each other, fighting the developers or fighting the real estate agents or fighting the homeless people, how can we figure out creative solutions? How can we talk and listen more in order to have the community that we want? These are more of my big questions for which I am leaning on all of you for answers. I'm gonna give you time for questions and answers. I just want to talk about a couple of more things. And I mentioned homelessness just now. And I looked up the date, and I'm pretty sure I correctly typed it into my notes this time. But it was 4 years ago this year that the signs went up in Santa Fe. And to me, this is a great sadness. And when I stop at an intersection and I see a sign that says, "Don't help your brother," it hurts my heart. But 4 years ago, our government put up signs on street corners, and they're still there, that say, and I know that the reason behind them was certainly done with a good intention, please give to the local charities, give to the homeless shelter, give to the food bank, so that these organizations can help people. But I don't feel like those signs really reflect my values. And so I think that we have not found a great solution for helping the people in our community that are homeless. We've talked about this in our church community a lot, and we have not sat idly by and complained about it. But there is a lot more that we need to do as a community to sort of figure this out. I think that the polarization I talked about earlier, the difference between the wealthy and the not wealthy, our willingness to accept the fact that some people can have houses and some people can't have houses, and all of that, it's part and parcel. The drug addiction, the lack of mental health services, all of it is part of the circle of life, just as much as the plants and the seeds and the trees and the rivers that we sang about this morning, right? Lastly, I'm just going to spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about the local water supply. It is an issue. It is probably something that hasn't changed a lot in the last 4 years. We spend a lot of tax dollars in our community to try to make sure that we have a resilient and redundant water supply. But partly we've done that because of extreme conservation measures, where some people are willing to take, to spend a great deal of their day and their week making sure that their home and their business doesn't use more water than is ethically reasonable. But at the same time, there are, other ways in which water is being used in our community that completely, countervail that idea. But in general, we have more people living in Santa Fe today than 4 years ago, and we're using less water. And that trajectory has continued for the last, that's the story of our community when it comes to water. We know that the climate change and the availability of water are going to be big factors as we move forward. That's why Santa Fe is pulling water from the Rio Grande and from wells, and we require conservation. And we have the Santa Fe Municipal Watershed, which is a protected area where our city reservoirs are. So if you were counting, that's 4 different sources of water. And so the idea is that as we face challenges, which we will face, that we will not face the challenge of turning on the tap and not having any water come out of it. I think that's probably a good place to stop. I feel like I've been a little bit on a soapbox, but that's what Talitha asked me to do. Right. I want to leave you with back to this idea about in the book, the road book that I told you about by Ben Goldfarb. I don't know how you make that shift permanent where you talk to your neighbors and you develop some consensus about a change you'd like to see, and then you work together and you get that change to happen. That's really the pipe dream of democracy. That is the ultimate hope of every church everywhere. But it's difficult to hold that, especially when I feel over-messaged. I feel like there's so many things coming at me that I don't know how in the world you can have all these messages coming at you and at the same time feel isolated and lonely. But I know that I feel that way, and I know other people do too sometimes. So I do think that trying to hold on to all of that and trying to talk to and listen to each other is what we can do. It's the best we can do. Phil asks, he says that there's a lot of construction going on around town. There's a lot of multifamily homes, apartment buildings being built around town. And yet, the price of housing does not seem to have been affected by that, and why that might be. I think that one of the reasons why that's not hasn't had an effect yet is because there was a prolonged period of no multifamily housing being built, and that the supply and the demand are not anywhere close to each other yet. And so, I only took the one economics class they made me take in college, but that, that idea that supply and demand are related to each other, I think is part of what's at play here. I will say that those new apartment complexes, as beautiful as they are also not, a solution to our housing crisis. I had a reporter who was living in a house his parents owned in Albuquerque during college, right? What a great deal for a college kid, And his parents were willing to co-sign a lease at the new Olympus apartment building. And he had a job, a full-time job at a local business, and I wrote a letter for him, and they would not give him an apartment. So, I think that we have a long way to go. So the question was, the words negotiation and compromise tend to have a negative connotation in our society today. And do I have any suggestions for how to keep trying to negotiate and compromise even amidst where we are? That's a hard one. I was thinking about this morning when Talitha was talking about fathers of all kinds and how today can be a hard day. And I was thinking about some of us, our dads are awesome, right? We have this really great memory of our parents, except for this one little thing, which is who they voted for president, who they're fixing to vote for again, And I don't have a lot of great advice for sort of how to have those conversations, except for that I'm still think we should keep trying to say, tell me why you feel the way you feel. In school and in journalism, you get those 5 questions you're supposed to ask, who, what, where, when, and why. I think why is the one that requires the most thought, the most listening. You can kind of figure out the other things, who and what and where and when, but why, you really have to ask. Why do you feel that way? Why do you want that? Why do you not want this? Why does that hurt you? Why are you afraid of that? Why, So maybe it's asking questions. Yes, Gail. And you have to listen when people answer. Very good. I really like that. Is that a way you really feel like it's changed? That's a change that you... So I'll repeat the question for the video. She said she was surprised I hadn't mentioned how many people run red lights as a change. And I do think that traffic is one of those topics that you hear from people who've lived here for a long time. You hear about how it's changed, you know. Have you ever been to Los Angeles? When I sit in traffic in Santa Fe for 3.4 minutes before I get where I'm going, I try to think about other places where they have real traffic. Not to minimize, because I do think that in general, people are like impatient. They watch too much NASCAR. They're a little bit too excited, you know, their time is too pressed. They really want to get through that light. They really want to get to the grocery. They want to get back home. Yeah, I've noticed that, for sure.
Yeah. Let me interject. Something that you were talking about with regard to the obelisk and all of that. I think one of the speakers we need to get in for this series is somebody who is a 14th generation Santa Fean. Because I think Anglos need to hear from Hispanic persons what it is like to have a sort of leapfrog over the Hispanic justice issues in a way in order to support Native Americans. Because I do think that's an issue. We've got to claim the fact that this territory that we're in was Hispanic persons' homes for 400 years before the U.S. took it over, before the U.S. invaded Mexico. And so I think there's some education we need to do, which is not at all to diminish Native Americans, indigenous persons' experiences. But I think as white liberals, we need some other voices in this whole conversation.
I'll tell you that one year, so we do the we, the them. I just left the Reporter 3 months ago. I'm still them and we confused. But at the Reporter, they do a photo contest every year in January. And we usually publish it a few months later. And one year, we published the photo contest on Holy Week. And the paper comes out on Wednesday, which is Ash Wednesday. And the winning photo in the photo contest was a Pueblo man standing on top of Cross of the Martyrs with a war spear in his hand. And Ron Trujillo, who might be a great person to invite, was a former city councilor. He was posing this morning at the cathedral with all the other living men who have served as Don Diego de Vargas. They're doing a group picture today. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. Ron is very passionate about the issue that Talitha just raised, about, the erasure of Hispanic culture, that idea, and how painful that is. And Ron was like super mad about that photo on the front cover. And he said, would you do a photo? Would you give somebody the first prize for a photo of a Spaniard with a sword standing over a grave? Would you do that, Julie Ann? And I said, no, Ron, probably wouldn't have done that. But I think it's a good little nugget of like how deep and painful things can be, and how a symbol of victory, a symbol of peace, a symbol of hope to one person is a symbol of violence and a fight for somebody else.
Any last words?
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you for listening.